Hello, cartoon fanatics, and welcome to another episode on Rick and Morty. And once again, we have a lot to talk about. That seems like every time I start one of these episodes, I always say there's a ton to talk about. But, that's because there is, and it's good stuff, so you better listen up. You better listen. So, today's episode. I know a lot of people were excited over Pickle Rick, but I think I was potentially the most excited about this episode when I saw the opening promo for it back when they were first advertising season 3. What was it called? Rest and Relaxation. I can't even say the title of this episode. But sort of the premise based on the promo that we got way early on is Rick and Morty have pushed themselves to their absolute limits, and at the end Rick's like, we need a vacation. And that's pretty much the beginning of this episode. And just off the bat, I was excited to see exactly what they would do with sort of what would be Rick and Morty relaxing. Like, have we ever seen Rick relax? I don't think so. I didn't even know he was the type of guy to relax or even crack down the way he does at the beginning of this episode. And Justin Roiland said that this was one of his favorites. I wonder if that's because he just really enjoyed the character dialogue or what, but he said this was one of his favorite episodes, and I can see why. Now, it's not so driven, it's not heavily plot driven, there's not like a ton of crazy stuff going on. Well, at least not the craziest stuff that has happened in Rick and Morty, or what had happened to Bird Person or anything along those lines. There's no like giant plot twist, there's no big revealing moments, but I can see why this is a great episode that Justin Roiland likes the best, because this episode is all about character study, and specifically the character study of Rick and Morty as separate beings and how they get along or coexist with each other, which is really fascinating from a writer standpoint. I absolutely love this episode from a written standpoint and a character understanding standpoint, because this was pretty much putting in a structure of Rick and Morty as characters, and sort of it was pretty much like a character study college essay thrown into a Rick and Morty episode, which means there's a lot of philosophical stuff in there to look at, but at the same time it's Rick and Morty, so that there's typical Rick and Morty humor. Alright, I'm gonna start rambling about the potential studies and actually go on and explain exactly what I'm talking about. So, like I mentioned in the very beginning, Rick and Morty, they go on this crazy perilous adventure, and at the end they're pretty much pushed to their limits. So Rick says, alright, let's actually relax, let's go to this alien spa, which is really good. And the next we see them, they're relaxing at this spa, and they go to this specific relaxation machine called the detoxification. So they go, oh yeah, that sounds good, like, detoxing chemicals, or sorry. So they're talking about like detoxing diseases or whatnot. So they both get in the machine, and it turns out that the detoxing machine removes what they consider to be toxins, not so much in a physical sense, but in a psychological and metaphorical sense. So the literal toxic parts of Rick and Morty, like the toxic parts of their characters, their weakest points, what makes them feel unhealthy inside, get pulled out and trapped in the detox machine. And then we have what is technically considered a healthy Rick and Morty. And this is where the character study comes in, because Rick's healthiness is very different from Morty's. So when Morty gets detox, he pretty much, he gets all of his anxieties and all of his, not annoyingness, but his anxieties and nerves and sort of the anxious, emotional wreck you can be when you're a teenager. Pretty much that's his toxicity gets taken out of him, and now we see a more confident Morty, a Morty that's not afraid to go at things. He actually asks Jessica out, but because he's almost too confident, Jessica thinks he's out of her league, and he agrees, and then he becomes like this sort of almost extremely successful, extremely popular guy now, and now that he's got all this confidence, the toxin was supposedly holding him back from his full potential, which is being able to move forward and speak out and have people recognize him and gain respect for him. Whereas on the other side, Rick's toxicity, which is probably obvious, it's his giant ego and all of his crudeness and his genius intellect that drives him and makes him think he's smarter and better than everyone else. That's his toxin, but then at the same time we get sort of almost a pathetic Rick. So it seems like they almost become opposites of each other, where Morty's the super confident one and Rick's the not so sure of himself one, but he's still a genius. He just demonstrates it differently. Not so much, I wouldn't compare him to Doofus Rick. I'd compare him more as this is a Rick that he's still the Rick we know, but it's as if he got a sensor on his brain and he just can't make himself say anything bad. Because now you got to make that YTV rating. Not so much, but that's kind of what we're dealing with here. And sort of halfway through the episode, the toxins manage to find their way out. Toxic Rick's like, you're terrible, now I'm going to destroy the whole world, your whole universe is going to become toxins. So they have like this huge epic battle between the toxic Rick and the detoxified Rick, and then it ultimately ends up in toxic Rick creating this machine to toxify the whole world, the whole planet, potentially the whole universe. But the way they stop them is what brings me back to the character study and what's so interesting, because the detoxified Rick, instead of knowing, he can damage toxic Rick all he wants and it'll do absolutely nothing. So instead he hits toxic Morty, and what the detox Rick says next is very interesting. The detox Rick tells the toxic Rick that he's got all the toxins, he's got the vulgarity, he's got the big ego, but at the same time he apparently has this huge protection, overprotective part of him. And the detox Rick's got, I know that you're super protective and you really care for Morty, because I sure don't care for Morty at this point. So, which is kind of the interesting thing. This shows why Rick needs his toxins. Because yes, the toxin gives him a big ego, and it makes him all vulgar and makes him rude, but it's also that toxin that makes him superly aggressively care for Morty. And without that, then he's just kind of this blatant, blasé genius scientist that doesn't really want to do anything with it. He's just kind of moping around and he doesn't really care about anything, which actually is almost worse. So in a sense, having a healthy Rick is worse than having a Rick with the toxin, because the healthy Rick doesn't care as much for his family as the toxic Rick does. So there's character study on Rick right there. You see these two balancing sides, where one is we see the Rick that seems like he doesn't care about anything or anyone, when really deep down inside he cares way too much, and that's one of the things that fuels him to be this crude and rude person. So that's fascinating for Rick in terms of character study. Now in terms of Morty, Morty's kind of a bit different. In fact, it's hard to tell whether Morty absolutely needs his toxins or not, but it seems like at the end of the episode Morty ultimately decides that he's better off with them, because he realizes that Rick actually does need him and Rick cares about him. But for a while, for about 3 weeks or so, Morty actually goes off. He becomes like super successful in the stockbroker business or something along those lines. And he's got this ultimate successful life, and he knows that Rick's going to come after him, because Rick's got the toxin merged with him at this point, but Morty hasn't. And Morty, pretty much, it's in his power to make sure that Rick can't find him or could never hunt him down. Like, he could always be one step ahead. But instead, he lets Rick catch up and put the toxin back in him, which is very interesting, because in terms of character, Morty doesn't need the toxin as much as Rick. That's pretty obvious here. Rick is, without his toxin, he's just not as caring as he usually is, and that makes him actually more dangerous and more sort of in denial with himself. But Morty, without his toxin, it's just all of his anxiety and all of his ness taken away, which makes Morty ultimately a better shell on the outside. But the fact that he decides to put the toxin back in him, it potentially to pacify Rick, is very fascinating. It really shows their character dynamic, and almost in a sense that Rick needs Morty more than Morty needs Rick. And Morty, even though he gets fed up with Rick and tired of Rick at a lot of points, at the end of the day, he knows that Rick needs him, and that's why he sticks around. So there you have it. There's some character study on characters you probably never thought you'd get this in depth with. So congratulations. You get Rick and Morty character study in depth. I've said study a gazillion times in this episode. But there we have it. I can see why this is Justin Roiland's favorite, because it really gets into exploring the dynamics between the two big characters that he voices on the show and created even back when there was just a rip-off of Back to the Future. So you've come a long way, Justin. This was good. I hope you have the chance to be able to develop and look further into these two characters that you love and care for so deeply, but pretend to hate on the outside, just like Rick. And that is it for this episode. I think if I start rambling any more about character studies, I'm just going to say study a bunch of times until I eventually pass out. So, if you like this episode, go ahead and put a thumbs up and press that like button. And don't forget to comment and subscribe as well. And I will see you next week for the next... Wait, what? No. Oh no! The next Rick and Morty is 2 weeks away! How will we ever cope?